This is the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast from Advanta IRA, where we show you how to explore investments beyond Wall Street and open your eyes to new options for your portfolio. It's time to take control and give yourself the freedom to choose where you invest your money.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Today, we are very pleased to welcome on Joe Tagliente, the managing partner of Tage Capital. And we've had some interesting discussions over the years here on the different avenues that people can explore with franchise investing and kind of the different models, what some of the different things look like as far as the FTC regulations and how to kind of migrate or how to kind of navigate that particular segment of the market when it comes to acquiring operational businesses and how that whole sector works. But to say that that's kind of all there is to it would be doing it a complete disservice. There are so many different avenues of ways to drive capital and other types of investments that can be done adjacent to franchising that I really wanted to have someone on here, such as Joe, that we can kind of explore that. Because in the vein of what we do here on the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast, understanding not only necessarily kind of the constituent investment that gets your foot in the door for a particular segment, but also how those things can kind of branch off into other avenues and other investments that are worth looking at. And that's what I'm really excited to kind of dig into here today with Joe. Joe, really appreciate you being on with us today. If you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of background about yourself and kind of how you kind of came to be your current role as managing partner of Tage Capital.
Of course. Well, Alex, thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today. So I got into franchising by way of my dad. I was a second generation Burger King franchisee. My dad started our company in 1969 when he purchased his first Burger King franchise in Somerville, Massachusetts. At the time, he was 46, almost 47 years old, and had always wanted to own his own business, and at that point felt that that was the best avenue for him to do that. And so purchased his first Burger King in Somerville, Massachusetts, went through the training, and then managed the restaurant himself until he was able to open a second, and then he brought in additional management people who helped him, and then he continued to expand the chain. He opened an additional, after that, got up to 10 restaurants, and then about that time, that's when I started to come into the business full time. I had always worked with my dad and for my dad as a kid when I was 12 and 14 years old, and grew up in the business. And then took a liking to the business. So I went to the Cornell School of Hotel Administration, studied hotel and restaurant management and financing, and learned everything there was to how to build hotels and restaurants, finance them, and so forth. And so went to work with my dad, developed 4 other Burger King restaurants, but then we also got into hotel development, built a portfolio of hotels under our own brand name, and then also some full-service restaurants. And then about the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, my father became ill and retired. And then my 2 siblings and I took over management of the company. We decided to pivot it away from operations and more towards the real estate part of the business. We had always, as a family, my father, one of my father's sort of values was that I remember he told me very early on, after he built his second Burger King, he said to himself, I'm making a lot of money selling hamburgers and French fries, but the landlord is making a lot of money collecting my rent, and he's sitting on his behind doing it. And so I want his job. And at that point, he made a commitment that would be one of his strategic commitments, that every time we built something, we built it on land that we owned rather than leased. And so, although that slowed down the progress of how many units we built, every one of the units we built was, completely consolidated as a fully owned asset. And so, towards the end of the 90s and early 2000s, we focused more on our real estate. We sold all of our operating companies and retained the real estate. So we sold our Burger Kings to Burger King Corporation, made them our tenants, and retained the real estate in the form of triple net leases, sold our hotel portfolio to La Quinta Hotels, retained all of the ground rights in the form of ground leases. And then I did a number of build-to-suit developments for some other restaurant operators, Brinker International, Charlie's, and some other companies. And so went from 450 employees down to 5, paid off all of our debt, and currently that's the business that we operate now. But I also love to, I'm passionate about franchising. I think it's a remarkable vehicle for helping entrepreneurs, excuse me, who have, determination and grit, but no playbook. They don't have a playbook. I think it's a wonderful vehicle to help those entrepreneurs get launched. And so I continue to help and coach and mentor and advise. And I teach at Boston University as an adjunct professor in franchising. And
Awesome.
So that's a pet project.
Great. So it's kind of a general theme I talk to across many different market segments. It's always kind of funny that the path more often than not leads back to real estate with investing, which I always find a little bit interesting. Almost as a general rule, and I would say probably like 80% of the investors I talk to on here that have any type of alternative lens on it start somewhere and then kind of matriculate eventually into something being a core focus of real estate, which I think kind of speaks volumes to the asset class in general. You can make tons of money in businesses and operations, but few things offer as many inherent benefits and flexibility as real estate really does. So let's kind of start maybe a little bit at the beginning, right? It's awesome to kind of see the familial genesis of being involved in franchising, especially with Burger King. I grew up in a franchising adjacent house. My dad was a marketing executive for a real estate advertising outfit that did their new franchisee development for them for many years through the 90s. So it's something that I am very familiar with, and I think is always a great avenue for people, especially for people that have that entrepreneurial spirit but maybe don't necessarily want to craft the idea from scratch, but definitely like the being their own boss aspect. But let's kind of look at that point. Was there kind of a specific catalyst that made you look at saying, okay, like, the franchising model is great. We're operating these businesses. We can see the cash flows, the revenues, the operations. But was there kind of a specific spark that said, hey, like, was it just being tired of paying for a land lease yourself? Or was it something else that kind of, drove you into saying, hey, like, investing in the dirt that these things are on is really kind of the, beneficial pathway for us going forward?
I think I think Alex, that the manifestation of, we'll say, the company value of we shall always own our own real estate probably came from an interaction that my father had with his landlord on his second Burger King back in 1975. I'm going to say 75, 76, somewhere in the mid 70s. So his his second Burger King was built on Tremont Street in Boston. It was a storefront in downtown Boston, across the street from the Boston Common, across the street from the Park Street station, one of the busiest stations in Boston's T subway system. And it was at the time the first Burger King in the system to break $1 million in annual revenue. So my father had a lease in place and, had at least at that point a pretty good relationship with the landlord. But the landlord saw that the money that he was making, and, he was very quickly starting to tell my father, when the time comes for us to renew your lease, we're going to be increasing your rent a lot because we see how much money you're making here, and you wouldn't make that much money if it wasn't for our real estate. And so that interaction right there, triggered a thought in my dad that, okay, we've got to be really fully in control of our own destiny. I mean, until that point, the only real estate that my father had ever owned was his home, our residence that, I lived in as a kid. And then at that point, he said, okay, this enough is enough. This guy is, being rather predatorial, and I can't have my future, my business at risk. And so that's what segued into his purchasing his first piece of commercial real estate for development, which would be Burger King number 3, and it also would be eventually a location that we would build one of our hotels on, our first hotel on. And, and the thing is that once he made his mind up to do that, it really slowed down the progress of the growth of the business from the standpoint of the number of units. Because, if you get into a franchise system, the franchisor wants you to do two things. First of all, they want you to be, ridiculously successful and financially happy and operating well. Good franchisors, okay, want you to be really doing well. Your business is going great. And what they want you to do is then take your profits, and reinvest it into the brand to expand the number of units that you have. Because for the franchisor, the big payoff is in the royalties to get the stream of earnings comes from the sales. So they continue to preach to franchisees, build more units, build more units, build more units, build more units. Well, my dad was like, I hear you saying that, but I'm only going to build units that I like to build. Okay. And so it took him, so he opened store number 2 in 1973. He opened store number 3 in 1978, 79, late 70s. I was 12 years old, so it was 1978. So it took him 5 years. The reason why it took him so long is because it took him that long to find a site that he believed in, that he was confident in, that he could purchase, and then he could also get approvals for, because the entitlement process for real estate, building a fast food restaurant in Massachusetts and going through the entitlement process in this state, it's like, breaking into Fort Knox with using only your forehead as a tool. I mean, it's just impossible. I mean, it's just they treat you like you're coming in with nuclear waste. It's just we're just trying to build a restaurant that's going to sell hamburgers and French fries. That's it. So anyways, I know I'm going to a long drawn out sort of explanation, but that's really how we came into that. That's what really triggered the whole thought of why do we want to own our own real estate?
Yeah, and I think that's something that kind of especially for business owners can really drive that. I've seen that in different friends that I've had over the years, family members and things like that is, if you're coming from the business side of it, being able to control your own destiny, because unfortunately, jealousy can rear its ugly head and things like that. And, it kind of stinks that it's like, hey, if your dad, wasn't doing so well, it's like, oh, well, that's fine. But just because someone had the idea and the drive to go do something, and I was like, oh, well, I deserve part of that, right? It's, that sentiment kind of can make people really kind of reevaluate things, and certainly from that point. So from there again, it takes the trajectory for getting seeing the real estate play out. And I think it's really interesting that coming from a background that was so steeped in restaurants, right, Burger King, fast food, that hotels would be kind of something that you branch into. So, you have that next location. So again, you're seeing the value in real estate right there. And I'm assuming kind of the capital for that wasn't just, straight bank financing. You were probably trying to maybe at that time, maybe speak a little bit to it, maybe saying, okay, well, let's reallocate some of our profits and revenues that we're collecting. And let's, instead of diverting that towards, the new locations, let's take a look at the real estate. So, from that perspective, if I'm right on that, like, what was kind of, again, was it just, were you trying to do more restaurants after that in like 1978? Or was it like, what was kind of the jump into hotels, right? It's a big difference between grilling hamburgers and putting heads in beds, right?
Yeah. Well, what's funny is once my father did, it took him forever to get store number 3 sorted out, built. But while he was doing that, he was also stashing as much cash as he possibly could. He was trying to build his own sort of internal organic war chest. And he was also trying to develop a team, some really good operations people who could help him, good legal people who could help him, a good controller, a numbers guy, people around him who could help him. And he went through people, and, trial and error. It's the same story for anybody who's a multi-unit operator. I have so many people who come to me and they go, this is easy, right? You just buy a bunch of Burger Kings or Dunkin' Donuts and you put some guy in there and then you just collect the checks, right? And I can go on vacation. I'm like, no, who told you that? I'm going to go tell them, It's wrong. You There's no such thing as passive. Okay, what there is everything needs some attention, but some of it needs on a scale of 1 to 10. With you have to be in it 100% of the time, 10, and then some of it is down to like maybe 5. But it completely passive. No. So while he was doing that, so what he was doing is, it's like one of those sort of Chinese bamboo trees that where you plant the seed, and for 5 years you don't see anything. You don't see anything, and all of a sudden this thing shoots through the ground, and it shoots like 30 feet up in the air. And you go, what was going on during that first 5 years? Well, what it was doing is underneath the ground, it was laying its root system, which would create foundational strength, and that's what my dad was doing. So then, after he opened Burger King #3, he went on a tear, and from 1980 until 1983, he built 5 Burger Kings. So he went from 3 to 8 over a short period of time, and then really
well, just real quick, all owning the land underneath of them in that way. Okay,
exactly. So that's what happened. He was establishing himself, developed. I mentioned the team developed a network of brokers that he worked with, and they were finding him locations. And the fact that he was able to move that fast, I said, well, he only built 5 restaurants, Joe. He built 5 restaurants in Massachusetts. And some of the places he built them are in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard and MIT are very, very liberal community, not terribly fond of fast food, okay? But he was able to get it done, okay? Places like South Boston. South Boston back in the 80s was like, if you didn't know anybody here or you weren't from here, you didn't get anything done. Now it's changed now. It's like one of the hippest, coolest places in Boston to live. But back in the day, it was difficult. But he was able to make his way through that. My father was very good at, developing relationships with local politicians and people, make friends, and they liked him. Oh, you're a nice man, and you're a family man. And, he was, he played football at the Naval Academy and served in the Korean War. And so people loved all that stuff. And so he went on a tear, and then he built all those restaurants. And then at about that time, I started to get very active in the business. At 14 years old, we were constantly talking, about the long-term planning for the business. People say 14, Joe, and I'm like, yeah, I was 14 years old. But at that point, I was so interested in the business, we would talk about it all the time. And so how we got into hotels was in the Burger King #3. I mentioned the first piece of property he bought. He bought a 3.5-acre piece of property off of Interstate 495 in Milford, Massachusetts. He bought it from the Archdiocese of Massachusetts. He'd go, I just made a deal with the bishop, I'm like, is he talking about chess? Anyway. So, but in any event, so we 3.5 acres. He took half of the property. He built his Burger King, and the other half lay there fallow, while we're trying to figure out what we're going to do with it. So, I head off to Cornell in 1985 to start studying hotel administration, and my dad, as I'm going there, says, while you're out there, you should learn about hotels. Who knows? Maybe that's what we'll do with the other piece of property. And so 1 semester, 2 semesters in, I'm like, Dad, we should absolutely build a hotel there. Okay, so let's get to work on it. And that's what we did. And so we investigated multiple franchises because we knew the franchise space, and like, let's go do this. So we looked at Comfort Inns and Red Roof Inns and all sorts of different things because it was a rural. I don't want to say rural, but it was like a suburban highway market, and we didn't like any of those brands, and we said to ourselves, I think my dad said this. He says, let's do our own thing and see how it goes. If it doesn't work, we can always go buy a flag afterwards and convert. That's the backup position. But let's go do our own thing. So while I was at Cornell, I'm talking to all of my professors. I had this wonderful professor, Bob Chase, who ended up becoming my advisor, and he was a specialist in hotel operations. And when we were building our first hotel, I would run up to his office during office hours with my plans and lay them out on the table. Like, they're having a problem on the 5th floor here. Do you know how we can do this? And, he loved it. He says, Joe, do you know how many of my students are building hotels right now? I said, no, how many? He goes, you're
Right.
it. You're it. What do you think? I got guys running in here building hotels while they're students? He goes, so he's a great guy. But we decided, excuse me, we decided to open it under our own brand name. And Tage Inns. We were going to call it Tagliente Hotel, but the sign guy is like, whoa, that's going to be very expensive. Cut it down. and so we opened it up in June 12th, 1988. We mortgaged ourselves up to our eyeballs to put together the $5 million that we needed to build that first hotel. And we opened it June 12th, 1988. In the first month we were open, we did 72% occupancy with no central reservation system or anything. It's just, we built such a beautiful hotel, and it's such great curb appeal, great location. It just went like that. And people started calling me immediately. I want to buy a franchise. I want to buy a franchise. I want to buy a franchise. And we were like, and we said, Jesus, we got something here. And so, we started to work on the development of our hotels, and that gave us independence from Burger King, because they saw, Jesus, these guys can do something else other than Burger King's. We need to pay attention to them. So it was a very interesting time.
Gotcha. So that's really interesting that it was, a little bit of like, hey, like, you're just, what you're studying in school, you're like, this could be interesting. And it actually worked out to that point. So you go from, again, Burger King, you get the itch for, diversification, you get into the hotel space, which is incredibly impressive that you decided to hang your own hat on a location and then manage to crack off 72% occupancy your first year. Being down here and my wife being in the hotel industry for as long as she's been there, again, numbers like that from just like, opening the doors and then getting that without having, a Hilton or a Marriott or a Lowe's or IHG stuck on the billboard is, and no central reservation system, and in the 80s, all very impressive. So, from there again, you have the first location. So again, I'm assuming again that to that point as well, like you handle the development and also own the real estate, right?
Yes. Yeah, we were completely vertically integrated, Alex, which is, if your wife will tell you, in the hotel business model, absolutely unheard of.
Yeah, it doesn't happen.
There's three entities. People don't understand this, that if you go to a typical Marriott, there's three entities associated with that hotel. There's the entity that owns the hotel, there's the property management company that manages the hotel, and then there's the flag, Marriott. Now, every once in a blue moon, Marriott's all three of those entities. Typically these days, they're only one entity. They're the flag. And so they get central reservation systems, royalty fee, central reservation fees, digital distribution fees, royalties, and then they let the owner deal with the mortgage, and they let the property manager deal with the property management.
Yep,
we're doing all three.
Yeah, whenever I explain that to anyone, they're like, "What? It's not just Marriott owning these things?" I'm like, "Oh no." And 100%. Like there might be, very very few and far between like wholly owned like Hiltons that are fully corporate, or Marriotts or any of them. In a particular metro area, there might be one out of hundreds of hotels. Like it's interesting when people kind of understand that. So, again, so you kind of started in the hotels. Now, did you go the franchising route with that, or did you just kind of keep the development for a little while of the Tage hotels?
Well, we continued to work on developing Tage hotels, but quite frankly, we went slowly. In fact, too slowly. My dad and I in 1980. So we opened our first hotel in 1989. And immediately after that, we're getting calls, as I mentioned. 3 weeks after we opened, or right around the time that we opened, Hampton Inn opened. Okay. And I was aware of those guys through the Cornell Hotel Mafia, that we call it. And so, and I was tracking their performance, and they were tracking about the same way that we were tracking. But the thing is that the gentleman who launched that brand, they were real estate guys. They were real estate developers. So they realized that, if we're going to build a brand, it's a numbers game. It's in bulk, and you got to get as many flags open. So they started to sell franchises flags before they even opened the first unit. And so by the time they opened, they had 15 Hampton Inns open. And then they went on a tear that they were selling lots and lots and lots of franchises, getting a lot of these things open. And then I think it was like 5 or 6 years later, they sold the brand to Hilton for $500 million. And at that point, we still only had 2 hotels. And once we started to get, and my dad and I got into a bit of a conflict here, or we'll call it a in an Italian family, you don't have conflict. You have debates where the father screams at the son, and the son goes, "Okay, Dad."
Yeah.
And so that's what we were doing. That's what we were doing. And I'm like, "Dad, come on. I mean, let's go. And my father is a traditionalist about franchising due to his experience with Burger King, who's saying, before we start selling franchises, we have to prove that this concept works. And the only way we can do this, we have to have at least, 5 or 7 of these that we own and operate ourselves. And I just said to myself, I said, Dad, that's going to take forever. And we're missing an incredible opportunity. We could sell, I said, I have a call sheet of 15 people right now who are ready to buy franchises right now. And he just wouldn't hear of it. And my father didn't make many bad decisions. That was one of the ones that I wish I had kind of leaned in hard to and convinced him more, because I think we could have done something. So what happened with the hotel company is we got it up to 4 units. The second hotel, it was 1992, 91, 92, and the bank that financed our first hotel, they were being audited by the Resolution Trust Corporation, the RTC. Mm-hmm. And like many banks, they were getting the hell kicked out of them in the audits, and they weren't in bad shape. But they called us and they said, we have 2 hotels now that we foreclosed on, and we got to get these off of our balance sheet. And do you guys want to buy one of them or both of them? So one of them was in Milford, Connecticut, and the other was in Andover, Massachusetts. So my dad said, why don't you go look at both of them? Let's see if maybe we can buy one of these things on the cheap. So we drove down to Milford, Connecticut with one of the other guys in our company. We looked it over and we said, it's a nice hotel. It's just too far away from home right for now. And then the second one, Andover, Massachusetts, was a 188-room Ramada Inn that had been previously a Koala Inn, which was a local brand. And so for 188 rooms, and it sat on 9.2 acres of property right on Interstate 93 in Andover, Massachusetts. So it's a beautiful piece of property right in the right on the interstate there. And we managed to get the bank to sell it to us it had a $6 million note on it, but I was playing golf with our loan manager, and he said, Joe, we know it's not worth the $6 million. I said, well, what can you sell it to us for? And he said, $3.2 million. We'll give you $2.2 million of new financing, but you guys got to come up with $1 million of cash. We got to get that asset off of our books, and we need to add cash to the bank. I'm like, okay. So, I got home, I called my dad, and I go, Dad, this is a great deal, but we got to come up with $1 million. And my dad's like, well, we don't have the $1 million. No, of course we don't. So, that night I was sitting there, and I'm sitting there in my house. I'm 25 years old, and I got my wife. My son Joey was a year old at the time. He's 35 now. And and we're a typical family, we're a typical young couple. We have a house and no furniture, just toys. And we had a couch, a TV, a kitchen table, and the rest of the house, and a bed to sleep, and a crib, and the rest of the house was empty. And I'm sitting there. I'm like, if I took a second mortgage on this house, I wonder how much capital I could scrape together. So I called my dad and I said, Dad, I think if I take a second mortgage out on my house, I think I'm gonna get $300,000-$400,000 out of it. And I said, what do you think? He says, well, what do you think about if I took a second mortgage out on my house? Now, my dad's 68 years old at the time. You don't go taking second mortgages out to buy a bankrupt hotel typically.
Yeah.
But my
Especially don't
father,
go to the bank that you're getting the paper from and say, hey, you want to do some second mortgages on our property so we
yeah,
can get this one off your REO rolls?
yeah, that's exactly right, Alex. And but that's just that's just testament to my dad. He was running and gunning until he couldn't any longer. So he says, "What? So what do you think?" I said, "Dad." He says, "What do you think you can get, Joe?" And I said, "Dad, I think I can get 400 out of my house. What do you think I use?" He's like, "I can probably pull 400, maybe even 500." And I said, What about the other 100, 200,000?" He goes, "You can probably scrape that out of the Burger Kings." I said, "Okay, what do you think?" He says, "This is a good plan." And he said to me, he goes, "Is Romy on board with it?" That's my wife. And I said, "Let me ask her."
Hold on a sec.
So she was right there, and she was in the kitchen with us and Joey on her hip, and she was shaking him. And I said, "Hey, Dad and I want to take second mortgages on our house to go buy this hotel. Are you on board with it?" And she goes, "So your dad's going to take a mortgage on his house?" "Yes." "And you're going to take a mortgage on this house?" And I said, "Yes." And she goes, "Okay." She goes, "Well, what happens if it doesn't work out?" I go, "Well, we're going to move back in with your parents, you know." And she goes, "Well, if you and your dad both think it's a good idea, go ahead." And so we did that, and so we bought that hotel for 3.2 million, and it's 18,000 a key. I mean, if you wanted to build that hotel today, it'd run you 350,000 a key minimum. We can, and then that hotel we bought it, and we did a renovation on it, and it turned out to be a huge hit, and it's not sitting on 9.2 acres. So when we sold it to La Quinta, of course, we kept the real estate. It continues to flow cash to us, but then also there was a tennis court on the property that nobody played tennis. It's nobody, and it was
Yeah.
just wasting. And I said to my dad, I go, "I'm going to build a restaurant on that." And he says, he says, "How are you going to do that?" And he goes, "We got a deed restriction with the restaurant next door." I'm like, "Let me work on it. I'll get it done." And so I made friends with the guy who owned the restaurant next door. He needed more parking for his restaurant. We wanted to build the restaurant there, so we did a deal. He got rid of the deed restriction, and so I did a build to suit, a semi build to suit for Chili's. I got the property all entitled and so forth, and then they came in and finished off the construction and built this beautiful Chili's restaurant that's one of their high-performing restaurants. And Chili's is an amazing tenant. I don't know if you've followed them in the news, but they're just they're world class in their segment. And so, that was just really a wonderful piece on how that played with real estate and taking advantage of opportunities, and then leveraging the assets that you have. It's like I say to my wife, shop in your closet, stop buying new clothes. This was a similar sort of a thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, from that catalyst, so now, this is again the early 90s. Now, what was kind of the reasoning behind then in turn, eschewing all the franchises that you had back into Burger King corporate? Because it's from the kind of the story right now. Again, I really like to expand on this, kind of to illustrate to people saying, look, if you have something that is generating cash flow, look at the periphery of the investment, right? And especially with real estate, it's a lot more apparent than saying, hey, you buy stock, right? What can you do? Well, you can, sell some options. You can, maybe borrow against the portfolio. But like with real estate, there's a lot of really interesting stuff on the peripheral of it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, such as, it's like, hey, this guy over here has a deed restriction. Well, he also needs more parking, right? So let's work out a deal. Let's get rid of that deed restriction. Or, if you have a tenant in there that maybe doesn't qualify for bank financing, if you're doing single family home rentals, like, okay, cool. Well, there's lease options. There's different things you could do to try to, be the banker, hold paper personally, and then, change your profile of your investment. That really few things other than, real estate, by extension, business ownership too, can offer you. So that's why I really like to dig into people that have so much experience in this to kind of illustrate where to look, right? Because so many people just want that list of things, but, take some ownership and take some franchise, no pun intended, for this conversation of what you're doing, and look around to what's adjacent to that. So where's this kind of lead into saying, okay, cool, we've done the hotels, we, all of our spouses are still with us because we, didn't have to get foreclosed on the second mortgages. What is kind of again the next avenue to saying, okay, like, let's really focus on this real estate and what it can do for us
Mhm.
and start pushing out the business, like the franchise and the business operations back out of our portfolios.
Yeah. Well, as I'd mentioned earlier in the interview here, Alex, we sold all the operating companies and went to being really a real estate holding company. And so what we're doing now is looking at our portfolio of properties and the leases and looking at what's going on in those markets around those properties and seeing, is a fast food restaurant or a hotel or something of that the best use for the property now, because we're getting to a point where the leases will be starting to come up for renewal or all a new lease altogether. And some of those properties will probably, remain. Maybe we'll extend those leases, but a lot of them, I envision, we'll be taking them back and doing other things with them. They're innovative and creative things that are, completely out of our safety or comfort zone. They will not be fast food restaurants. Maybe they'll be, multifamily buildings or life science buildings or other types of facilities that, here in Massachusetts, particularly the greater Boston area, warrant interest. My son, who I mentioned earlier, when he was a baby, he's a full-grown guy now. He's very, very involved with industrial real estate, and I know that he has spoken to me about, strategically us pivoting towards a focus on some level of industrial real estate. He really has a tremendous passion and just a natural sort of sixth sense for the business, and so, us diverting, capital and assets towards that will be something that I expect we do in the very near future.
Yeah, the industrial space is really interesting just from the fact that there haven't been as many kind of eyes on it. And I've spoken with a few different people, and I was very surprised because the first time I kind of talked to some people in the industrial space, I assumed that just like with anything in real estate, it's there's not a whole lot of difference when you get to the commercial aspect of it. Obviously the tenant utilization, what it's doing, entitlements, zoning, those kind of things are going to be there no matter what. But I just assumed, hey, all this stuff is probably just triple net. It's you have your avatar of who you're kind of trying to focus on, whether it's light industrial, heavy industrial, that kind of thing. And the amount of kind of the mom and pop operators in the industrial space I found pretty interesting, for a lot of different locations, on the fact that it might be stuff where the ownership of that property is still paying for maintenance and taxes and things like that. They're not on a triple net, and there's a lot of ways to just kind of bring things up into a more current profile of how you're doing the investing that otherwise wasn't afforded, which again just kind of goes to show making assumptions, especially in real estate, can leave a ton of money on the table, right?
Yeah.
Assuming anything with this space can, and again, that's the nice thing is that it doesn't always work to your detriment, right? You can still make money, but just kind of keeping up with the times can really drive some additional revenues from things that you just otherwise might not realize. So from that kind of transition now, what I'm really kind of interested in is that you said that you're basically kind of the landowners. You're doing land leases for different operational businesses. Now, how does that kind of come to fruition? Are you going in and still, like, did it come where you're like, hey, buying a business and then selling the business and keeping the land? I think that kind of is what happened with the other locations and things like that. But how does that kind of transition into a business model? Like, how do can you just go to some of these places and just buy dirt? Right? Like, I don't understand that aspect of it. I've not really dove too far into this segment too much, really. So I'm really interested to know how that kind of comes into play with doing land leases, because everything I'm used to is, owning the building, tenant, landlord kind of relationship stuff.
Yeah. Well, for us, it was a slam dunk because we'd already developed the property. So when it came time for us to sell the businesses, we were able to really craft the structure that we wanted to have as the landlord. However, if there was somebody who said, geez, they're listening to us talking like, geez, I want to own a bunch of Burger King and Chili's leases like this guy does. How do I go about doing that? And, the fact of the matter is there are brokerages out there that specialize in selling only net lease properties of retail tenants, whether they be Starbucks or McDonald's or Burger King, Popeyes, fried chickens, you name it. There's literally hundreds of different properties out there. These things tend to trade on not the highest cap rates, and it certainly depends on the quality and the credit of the tenant. If you buy a Chick-fil-A franchise, if you buy a Chick-fil-A net lease, probably I've seen them as low as 3.98 cap. So I mean, it's you must really really want to be a Chick-fil-A landlord. What drives a lot of the demand is you have 1031 exchange buyers who are on day 43 and like,
Yeah.
I need something. And, and so they lock the thing in and they identify it, and then their tax deferral is safe. And those buyers tend to be, mom and pop. They tend to be typically mom and pop multifamily operators who get tired of tenants and broken toilets, and they're like, I'm done now. And my in-laws, my wife's parents, they were like that. They owned a really nice portfolio of apartments in greater Boston area, Cambridge, Somerville, Medford. They had buildings that were. They had one of their buildings that all of their tenants were graduate students at Harvard and MIT, and they're like, all this thing does is print cash, and these are the best tenants ever because they're nice, respectable students. A lot of them from foreign countries, and they don't even sleep. All they do is sleep in the place. They get up at 5, they run to the university, they're there all day long, and then they come back, they pass out, and wake up and do it all over again. We get the apartments back; it's like they've never been lived in. And they did that for a number of years, and then my brother-in-law had no interest in business. My wife did not. They asked me if I was interested, and I just had my hands full with my own things. And so when they couldn't identify a successor, they sold their apartments, and then they 1031 the capital into a couple of net lease assets. One was a self-storage asset, and the other was a DHL distribution center. DHL delivery.
Yep.
And so it's somewhat passive cash flow that and for those of you in your audience who don't know what triple net means, it means it's net of taxes, net of maintenance, net of insurance. Triple net, the tenant pays for all of those things, and you as a landlord have minimal to no responsibilities. Again, as I said, there's no such thing as passive. But on the scale of 1 to 10, that tends to be in the lower range. So as I mentioned, there's brokers out there. If you buy, if you buy an asset that has the thing I would warn people is, look at the credit quality, look at the underlying real estate that goes with it, because for a lot of these assets, you buy a car wash for $5 million somewhere, and you say, okay, well, you got 100% bonus depreciation. Let's take that part off of the table. It's a $5 million car wash somewhere in Tempe, Arizona. Okay, in the event that the car wash goes dark, what's the thing worth then? Is it worth $5 million? Okay, can you replace that cash flow? Can you replace that? Can you replace that tenant? Can you replace that operator? And so forth. Because a lot of these assets, the value is all baked into the lease, and if the property goes dark, then you have a situation.
Yeah, which is kind of a really interesting point that I think, especially for our audience, and what we kind of focus on a lot here is, focusing more on like a lot of us focus on the performance of the, utilization, but also the land value. But when you're kind of doing this in a form and fashion where you have kind of a built-to-suit structure on top of a lease piece of ground, then what happens if the business goes away, right? Like it's you need to have some other type of ancillary business that can go in. If it's $1 million business but $50,000 pad, then what are you kind of trading that on, right? How do you affix value, and how do you kind of effectively say, getting, again, taking things out that really sweeten the deal, like, 100% bonus depreciation, which again, it's nice that it's sticking around. I think for all investors, we're kind of happy that that one got plugged back in there for the real estate crowd. But really, making sure that you look at it on a more objective basis, right? Because I think that's when in this area is a lot more apparent, right? Apartment complex, right? People need a place to live, right? So long as that it's not too terrible or you're building too far outside the profile of the tenant that's going to be coming in there, right? you know Again, you're probably going to be okay. But Chick-fil-A goes out of business. Well, I guess Chick-fil-A doesn't really go out of business, but what I'm trying to say is that divorcing that examination a little bit and looking at what your actual tangible asset value is especially important in this segment.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, you just hit the bullseye with a laser beam with that one. And as you were talking about Chick-fil-A and everything, the example that popped into my head is, because for your audience, they're probably, well, yeah, that's a good question. If these things are such high quality tenants, then when did how typically did they get shut down? Alex is right. You never see a shut down Chick-fil-A. And for the most part, there's a lot of truth to that. But, every once in a while, something crazy happens. Right now, the thing that I'm looking at, and everybody that I talk to, because I have a lot of friends in franchising, I have a lot of friends in real estate, particularly net-lease real estate. I have one friend in particular. He's a broker, a commercial broker, and I won't say him or his firm's name, but he's a very, very conscientious guy. And so he was telling me recently, he says, I'm getting calls from, 80-year-old grandmothers who did a 1031 exchange 20 years ago, where they sold an apartment building they owned with their husband. Husband passed away. And then I helped them do a 1031 exchange into a brand new Walgreens lease. Now, 20 years ago, that was a grand slam home run. You did a great job for them doing that. These things are shutting down left and right now, and it's really it's really kind of a tragedy. It's kind of an epidemic here. And when you see these Walgreens and they're dark, it just makes you scratch your head. Like, what happened there? I mean, 10 years ago, that was the belle of the ball. 20 years ago, that was the belle of the ball. And now, and that's how Walgreens built their business. They'd buy a piece of property. There was a brand new Walgreens, big box Walgreens opened up near my home, and I remember explaining to somebody how Walgreens grows their company. They buy a piece of raw land on a busy street on Main Street, USA. Maybe they spend $500,000 on it. They put $1.2 million into building their building on top of it. Another $500,000 or $1 million to stock it with inventory. Now they're ready to open, so they put $2.7 million into the property. Then what they do is they turn around and they sell it. They write a lease to themselves for 25 years with no rent increases, and then they sell that lease with the property. They do an internal sale lease back to an investor for $3.2 million. They get all their money back plus another $500,000. Wash, rinse, repeat. Beautiful, beautiful business plan. Provided that you stay open the entire 25 years and you continue to pay and you continue to pay. So my friend who I mentioned, he's like, I have 80-year-old women. They're coming to me, what am I going to do? They're going to close. They're going to stop paying rent. What am I going to do? And he does not have an answer for them. And so, that's a thing that has to be taken into consideration. The what if this goes dark question has got to be paramount in looking at these investments.
Yeah, and also from the fact, just kind of what I've seen in my area, also paying attention to where where development's happening, right? If it's in a very newly developed area, right? Okay, the point I'm trying to make maybe doesn't hold as much water, but where I live down here in St. Pete, I've seen a few locations where things get redeveloped and okay, there's more space, and then the location moves across the road, right? It's the franchise didn't go anywhere, right? But your McDonald's that's been on this kind of crusty corner that has no parking and the drive-throughs on an access road. Well, okay, well, let's just move it across the street, new building. Well, the landowner for that one now is left holding the bag for something that has been there for forever and a day. So
Yeah.
I've seen that happen around our area too. Of what you need to look at when doing this, from what I'm hearing for you, is just kind of a different profile of risk, right? With any investment, there's risk, but understanding where those risks lie is important, and especially if it's kind of a new lens that you're looking at real estate when you're dealing with big corporate partners as opposed to individual tenants, heads and beds, hotels, things like that. It's just a little bit of a different way you have to look at it, and also where you're kind of projecting where that risk is going to lie and how you kind of mitigate that.
Right.
Uh, and I'm assuming kind of the mitigation for some of this stuff is it's probably not too terribly, exotic in what you're looking at, but it's also not that easy always to pin down, right? Making sure that they're gonna, be there for a long time. The Walgreens one, who could have seen it? Again, you just don't kind of see those things coming, but they do happen. Are there any kind of specific points, tips, and tricks that you've seen of things that kind of help to, or at least kind of like how you can kind of navigate that effectively?
Well, the old saying is every problem creates an opportunity, and I've seen some really aggressive and not risk averse real estate people actually celebrate and embrace these defunct pharmacies. And I have one friend, I think he's out of the eastern Pennsylvania area, and he was telling me that he bought a Rite Aid that was dark Rite Aid. They went bankrupt. He says, Rite Aid, a struggling brand, but the real estate was fantastic. And so he was able to buy it, demolish it, do all of the necessary site work, and get it entitled for a Raising Cane's, and then Raising Cane's, and executed a long-term lease, and then took it from there, built out their restaurant, and got open for business. So he went from having a dark Rite Aid to a brand new Raising Cane's. And I've seen that done a number of times. Now, there is some risk associated there, and there's a downtime. You got to go 2-3 years of perhaps, carrying the real estate taxes and the insurance, and making sure that putting a fence around the property, make sure dumpers aren't dumping their trash there, and carrying insurance so that if somebody walks by and trips and falls, they're not trying to sue you. And then, the entitlement costs, to get a Raising Cane's approved could, maybe it takes 5 months, 6 months in some municipality. Maybe it takes years because people are like, we don't want another fast food restaurant here. And so, but in the event that you can get that done, you take you take a broken asset and turn it into something, or distressed asset and turn it into something valuable. And then after you do that, you can turn around and sell it in 1031, the upside, into something else that's more stable, or can just hold the property and continue to, clip the coupons and collect the distributions. And at that point, your cash and cash returns are probably, really tremendous, 30, 40, 50% or higher at that point.
Yeah, and again, that kind of especially illustrates the point of just being creative. Where one door closes, another one inherently does open in this industry, which is great, but also making sure that, one, you're positioned to take advantage of that, and two, that you're not on the unbalanced side of that equation, right? Or at least more often than not, you're not going to be there, right?
Yeah.
No one bats 1,000 in anything, right? But making sure that you're properly positioned and you've kind of identified those things, and especially have competent people that can guide you, like I'm assuming what you kind of have moved into as well, is definitely of paramount importance. So, again, I think it's been a really, really great conversation. I really do enjoy getting to talk to people that have had so much experience in various things, and have seen things rise, change, pivot, and be able to make really interesting avenues of growth in especially real estate, but with any type of business that people just don't often necessarily look to or think about being pathways forward for them. And I think we've definitely kind of hit the marker on this conversation. So, Joe, with Tage Capital, what kind of things do you kind of offer outwardly? Or do you do a lot of education? Do you have investment opportunities for people, and also how can people reach out to you as well?
Well, the thing that I've been doing a lot lately is, I may mention, a passion project for me is to help entrepreneurs who are interested in franchising, whether they want to make their first investment into franchising, or if they're established franchisees in a brand and they're trying to figure out how to expand their brand. I love working with those people, those entrepreneurs, helping them by providing them with coaching, mentorship, community, also can assist them with financing the expansion of their business. And if any of those people, and if any of your listeners are interested in that, I would advise them to just look me up on LinkedIn. connect with me or DM me. I'm happy to chat with them.
All right, fantastic. Joe, really appreciate you taking some time out of your day. The most valuable asset we all have is our time, because no matter how well we invest, we can never make any more of it. So appreciate you taking a little bit of time out on this Friday afternoon or morning to chat with us and our listening audience. This has been the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. As always, my name is Alex Perny, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you for tuning in to the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Tune in next week for more investing tips and strategies.
Want to hear more episodes of the Alternative Investing Advantage? Search podcast at advantaira.com and subscribe.